Throughout the ages, people have imagined apocalypses, but how they determined the end of the world shaped their philosophies, as is still the case. From natural disasters and moral revenge to our modern situation of increasing AI and anthropogenic concerns, contemplating the end of days can help us cope with the world as it is, or prepare us for difficult times ahead. In an actually not morbid at all conversation, Christopher Starr, professor of classics at Middlebury College and author of Apocalypse and Golden Age, The End of the World in Greek and Roman Thought, discusses how the ancients thought about catastrophe and why we should think about it now. But before we get started, a quick shout out to our Classical Wisdom members. Thank you for all of your support. Please go to classicalwisdom.substack.com to sign up for our free newsletter and also to learn how you can join our awesome classics loving community. Now, for the end of days. Okay, so we're talking about apocalypses because, you've written this excellent and very interesting book called Apocalypse and the Golden Age, The End of the World in Greek and Roman Thought. So I always like to just sort of begin at the beginning, which is always a good place to begin. What did the end of the world look like for the ancients?
Well, there were a lot of, I think, like today, there are a lot of different scenarios. And I think scenarios is a good way to think about how the ancient world functioned in terms of at least the thought experiments, right, and thinking about the end of the world. It could happen in a lot of different ways. And sort of where my research focuses on is looking at it from the perspective of Greek and Romans and how they looked at the end of the world. And they had a lot of different ways of looking at it, as opposed to perhaps the more familiar biblical, right, Apocalypse of John and Daniel from the Bible, where there's, these very specific predictions about what's going to come soon. So, and that's part of it, right? That's sort of part of the ancient Mediterranean world. And you can see some influence perhaps back and forth. But I think it really starts for ancient Greeks and Romans, at least with Hesiod, all the way back in 700 BCE, where he predicts that Zeus will destroy the Iron Race, right? And that's sort of the first sort of looking to the future, perhaps a warning, perhaps people can avoid it. He doesn't specifically say what's going to happen. He just says Zeus will destroy the Iron Race. And of course, they also had, right, floods and fires, different stories in myths, right? The story of Deucalion, sort of their Noah. And that, of course, was within early history. And then Phaethon, who tried to drive the chariot of the sun and almost burned up the world, right? So there was these ideas of fire and floods coming in myth, at least in the past, and perhaps in the future. And, starting with the philosophers, it seems that the philosophers, as opposed to sort of religious thought, this idea of by studying nature, right, you can actually figure out past destructions and perhaps future destructions as well. So fires and floods being sort of the big ones. Plato comes in and he offers a lot of different scenarios. He says fires, floods, disease. And then he says there can be many other ways, right? He sort of leaves it open. Trying to think now, different thinkers. Democritus, the atomists, said, well, they believed in multiple worlds. And they said, well, sort of like asteroids, perhaps, that we're worried about today. They say planets crashing into other planets brings about the end of the world. Most of them are usually like renewal and things like that. Something comes after these. But yeah, the Epicureans and the atomists seem to think that, end of the world, full stop. A planet crashing into another planet. Epicurus himself, who was an atomist, so building on that, seems to think that, right, he says each world has this envelope, which seems sort of like he's thinking in terms of an atmosphere. And he says, well, then when that atmosphere disappears, basically the whole world dissipates, into its constituent atoms. So again, it's not the end of the world. There are other worlds, but it would be the end of our world and the end of other worlds. The Stoics thought in terms of fire, the ekpyrosis, sort of that the entire universe itself returns to fire. And this is sort of the cyclicality in the truest sense. Right. So the entire universe sort of returns to fire, and all that's left is Zeus or Jupiter, sort of the divine agent, right, is left. And then the world starts up again. And how exactly it starts up again was a matter of debate. Some people, it seems, said that the exact same things happen over and over again, right? Socrates gets tried again and executed, and they give those examples. The Stoics may have also believed in a flood as well. We have that in Seneca, where he talks about sort of an ekpyrosis, but also sort of this cosmic flood. So those are, I think, sort of the main ones. Lucretius also talks about who's an Epicurean, and he's interesting. He doesn't follow Epicurus or Democritus in terms of planets or loss of atmosphere. He says, well, it could happen gradually, right? The Earth sort of loses its fertility. He has sort of a very sort of almost eco-critical early environmental concern. He's not doesn't say that we're doing it necessarily, just as well the Earth is growing old, but there could be something, lying behind it in terms of farming and things like that. But then he also says, well, if the universe is governed by fortune and not by the gods, it could happen at any time, and we may actually witness it in our own time. So it's actually Lucretius is interesting. It's one of the first people, at least among Greek and Romans, who really, says, well, this is something we might see. Whereas, people like Plato and the pre-Socratics, and it seems like Democritus and Epicurus just have sort of this idea that, yeah, this is how the nature works, right? Everything that's created has to die. But there isn't sort of this idea that it could be coming soon.
Yeah, so they didn't assume that they would be witness to it, which is a very different mindset.
Right.
And it is really astonishing to think that since the beginning of time, people have been thinking about the end of time. Is there any reason why the ancients thought about that, or why we think about it today? I mean, is that something sort of innate in human nature to think about?
Yeah, another fascinating question, of course, right? My area is thinking about the ancient Mediterranean world and a little bit the ancient Near East. In terms of cross-cultural studies, it seems that, there are ideas, at least about a cataclysmic flood, either primal and perhaps, in the future, some sort of end coming. The Greeks and the Romans usually most people, when they think about them, they say, well, they don't really have, a Ragnarok, a twilight of the gods, or, an end of the world, mythological scenario. And in some ways that's true. As I was saying, it's mostly sort of philosophical thought. There isn't this idea that the gods necessarily will die in, Greek and Roman myth, the way we think about it in like Norse mythology, or Jewish and Christian idea of sort of this cosmic battle happening. So it does seem to be something, though innate to human, was certainly in the ancient Mediterranean world. As I've been trying to argue that it's not just sort of Jewish and Christian thought, that philosophers, Greek and Roman philosophers, are thinking about it too. And where does it come to? Where does it come from? Is an interesting question. Perhaps some people have said part of it ties to our own, feelings that we know we're going to die. So perhaps there's some comfort in thinking about how everything else, right, is part of this cycle of birth, death, and decay. And we see this a lot in the philosophers. There's this idea of, especially in Lucretius in De Rerum Natura, the idea that, well, you're going to die, but so is the world as well. So there is sort of this macrocosm, microcosm, I think, thinking behind it. Some of it has to do, I think, with much like today, feelings of globalization. There's a lot of studies about, in both, especially in Jewish and Christian thought, about the concept of empire, right, of world empires, and how, right, Revelation celebrates the end of Rome. Daniel most likely, predicts the end of, the Seleucid Greek Empire. So I think some of it also has to do with feeling of living in a world that sort of reached its limits, and there's no place else to go. The political culture as well has become so corrupt. Morality is a big thing behind it as well. That either God or the nature of the universe itself is going to come in and have this reset. There is this idea of some sort of a reboot, right? And usually, right, there is, again, we talked about the end of the world a little bit. I think it's also sort of imagining, well, what comes next in some ways, that, our world has reached its limits. Let's imagine what happens next. So Revelation, right, 20 chapters or so of death and destruction, but right at the end, there's this idea of a new Jerusalem, and something new will come. Same thing in the ancient thought as well, right? There isn't sort of this perfect world, ancient Greek and Roman thought there, but there is this idea of society rebuilding itself. So I think it has a lot to do with sort of imagining limits, right, to the present system, and thinking about how the present system might come to an end, and then what comes after it. So I think a lot of it has to do too with just sort of political theory, and imagining sort of the limits of our present world.
So is there a sort of a specific cultural or political milieu in which these kind of ideas are more fertile, like a specific point in the cycle of
Yeah.
an empire.
Right. Yeah. And so it usually gets tied to this thinking of, right, the course of empire, right? This idea, I think in some talks I've done and articles I've written, it usually gets tied up in that cycle of paintings, right, from the 19th century, this idea of apocalypse and empire. And there are a lot of studies that talk specifically about, right, apocalypse and empire. I think that works, right? In some ways, certainly, there's this thinking, from the Jewish Christian perspective, there's this idea that Jews and Christians are outsiders, right, to Greek and Roman empires, and of course, right, the wrong king is on the throne. It's Nero or it's Antiochus, and of course, right, the true king is God, right? So a lot of it is sort of political, fighting against sort of the dominant empires now, and this feeling of outsiders, feeling persecuted, and that's certainly there. And in some ways, it can, sort of spark real violent military action, right? So Daniel is written in the context of, a war, right? The Maccabean revolt in the, about 160s against the Greeks, and it was successful. Revelation is written in the context, most likely too. With Christians, we don't necessarily see it so much in terms of violent revolt, but it is, again, written in the context of the First Jewish War and the destruction of the temple in 70, right? So there is sort of this idea of violent revolt against empire, and in that case, in some ways, the failure of the revolt, the destruction of the temple, and trying to figure out how to function in this new world, right? Where obviously Christianity is growing. Judaism has to redefine itself, not as a temple-based religion, as, and in some ways it sets the stage for the modern world, focusing on rabbinical Judaism. So there definitely is that. With the Greeks and the Romans, you can certainly see it too in the crisis of the Roman Republic, time of Julius Caesar. That's when Lucretius is writing in the 50s BCE, most likely, right before Julius Caesar crosses the Rubicon, where the Roman Republic is in crisis. And Lucretius says, I'm living in this difficult time. I hope I can write this text, to help people. And also, I hope I have the peace of mind to write this text. And then, he does talk about, as I said, the end of the world, we could witness it. So there could be some political thought and connections there as well. Again, Seneca, too, the other sort of main Greek and Roman, or I should say Roman apocalyptic thinker, is writing under Nero, most likely. So there is sort of this interesting cross-fertilization between Christians thinking of Nero perhaps as the Antichrist, and then Seneca, and then writers after Seneca thinking of Nero as sort of this nadir of civilization, and hopefully things will rebuild. And as well, even Plato, right? His take on, at least in one account of his looking at different catastrophic scenarios, he brings in Atlantis, right? Atlantis as sort of this evil empire that the Athenians, right, free the Mediterranean from. And then one of the reasons Atlantis is destroyed is because of these terrestrial catastrophes. So it does definitely tie into sort of political contexts and moral contexts, but at the same time, there is, in the Greek and Roman tradition, as I've already said, there is this long tradition that goes all the way back to Hesiod, and he's writing in archaic Greece, in small scale city-states in some sense. There's no Greek empire to speak of. So it's in some ways, it's already there, right? This idea of Zeus is going to get angry at us, and there it's much more of sort of a moral way of thinking, people not respecting strangers and families and things like that. So there we see it in a much smaller scale context.
Yeah, you definitely don't want to piss off Zeus. I mean, that's
No.
always
Yeah.
always be nice to your guests, everybody. Xenophobia,
Right.
it's more than just a problem. But I'm wondering, because you're initially sort of outlining all these different types of apocalypses,
Mhm.
whether it's a flood or an asteroid, and the consequences of them are very different. I mean,
Right.
you might be able to survive a flood, but
Yeah.
asteroid, not so much. Um, unless you know something that I don't know.
Yeah, no,
But
I did. Yeah.
but did these sort of different apocalyptic scenarios result in very different philosophical approaches
Mm.
to them?
Excellent question. So, again, to think about the ancient world in terms of Greek and Roman, there are these, fascinatingly different scenarios. And on the whole, like the great Jewish and Christian idea, there is this idea of, right, something comes after it. There isn't an idea of sort of a heavenly Jerusalem or God's kingdom on earth. But there is this idea of, right, so from Plato and most of the philosophical thought is this idea of cyclicality, that there are survivors of a flood, and it's sometimes it's Deucalion and Pyrrha, who are basically sort of like Noah and his family. So there are these ideas of these pious people that survive in the mythological tradition. But generally, for the philosophers who take this idea of a flood, Plato is pretty explicit, and he says, well, actually, most civilizations get wiped out. The people who survive a flood are just happen to be, people who live high up. So again, geography plays a lot to it, right? Where you live, similar to today, right? As we were talking about earlier, this idea of, people moving to New Zealand or hoping to move to New Zealand, right? To survive, whatever nuclear catastrophe or some other anthropogenic, right, crisis that happens. So Plato actually sort of realizes that already. And he says, the people, and he sees them more as pastoral people who don't have culture, don't have civilization. And he says, well, they survive, yes, but we've lost writing, we've lost literacy, we've lost politics, and society rebuilds itself, usually in pretty much the same way, right? We get the pastoral people, and then we get kingship, and then different, forms of government come out of that. So there usually is that idea of sort of this reboot of society with a few people surviving. With the Stoics, it's interesting. It's not 100% clear how people survive the ekpyrosis. It just seems that perhaps people just get reborn, perhaps a small group of people, usually seen as sort of like a golden age world where everything is perfect, and then sort of decline sets in. So generally, there is this idea of some form of survivors, people living in a world much like ours, right? It's not sort of this otherworldly millennial kingdom or anything like that that they have. It's basically sort of, on the ground, people recreating society. Again, much like, The Walking Dead or something like that we have this idea of there will be survivors, and they're going to try out different forms of ways of living together. There's going to be some people who want to be kings. There's going to be some people who try to, be more democratic about things. So there's that idea. But at the same time, as I said, the Epicureans and the atomists, they thought about the end of the world, literally the end of the world, not the end of time, right? The universe still persists, and there's still atoms and void creating new worlds. And again, in this random universe, perhaps our world could be, recreated just as it was. But for them, it's sort of like, if you've seen the movie Melancholia, right? The planet crashing into the earth, or, some form of earthquakes. But basically the idea is dissipation of our atoms and, the complete end of our world. So there was that as well, but the Epicureans, were always sort of seen as outsiders and things like that. As problematic to, as well. I think Cicero writes De Republica, most likely sort of responding to Epicurus's, view, and the Epicurean view, and Lucretius's view specifically about how the world's going to end. Because in De Republica, he brings back the Platonic idea about, cyclical catastrophes, and Rome may die, but civilization and humanity will continue on Earth.
Was it that little story, apocryphal story of Solon when he was in Egypt, and he was talking to the Egyptians, and they were like, "Oh, you Greeks, every time, your world ends, you forget how to write again. What's your problem?"
Right. Yeah.
And it is an interesting thought, though, to talk about, who survives, and pastoral versus, the cultured people. Did the ancients wish the end of days or try to avoid it, or was it a coping mechanism with the level of, or lack of control over natural events that we like to think that we have more control over, but don't always?
Yes, I think there's a lot to that. And to bring up, just to touch back on that point too, yes, right. So Plato in the Timaeus and Critias, when he's talking about Atlantis, he does say, right, Egypt is in this special place. Egypt preserves human knowledge forever, but generally the rest of the world for him loses it. And there's this idea, right? The famous line that you Greeks are always young, right? You're always losing and rebuilding, whereas Egypt, is sort of this place that preserves all knowledge and remembers all the cataclysms. So that's one good example. But of course, in different dialogues, he doesn't talk about that. So Plato really seems to be playing with different scenarios. But yeah, Egypt comes across as this one place that because of the Nile specifically. So again, geography, it's able to survive fires and floods. But I think part of to come back to your point, you're absolutely right. In some ways, to come back to your original excellent observation. In some ways, a lot of this, in terms of coping mechanisms, a lot of this is, fear, I think, of Westerners, specifically thinking about in modern terms, the current interest in it is fear of losing comfort and things like that, right? That the knowledge and at least sort of somehow acknowledging that we wouldn't make it in a lot of ways, right? If you, in a lot of movies even show this, right? If you wear glasses, if you're on medication, if you have a chronic condition, sort of forget it, right? The universe or the society that's rebuilding, just can't support you, right? Because that world is gone, right? This world of comfort, this world of medicine and technology. And if you're relying upon those things, if you're not sort of the survivalist, forget about it. And I think that's already there in Plato. And in some ways, Plato's sort of the first sort of climate fiction writer, I think, with Atlantis. But to get to your other point, I think that ties into it, sort of this idea of a coping mechanism. As I said, I think in some ways, at least for Greek and Roman thought, one of the main things they like to point out is the basic idea that everything dies, right? Certainly, there's this idea of eternal Rome, which is an interesting question to get into, right? Eternal Rome versus the eternity of God's kingdom. So, alongside of this, there is also this discourse of eternity with Rome versus God's eternal kingdom, and I think there's definitely some intellectual sort of back and forth, perhaps at certain times about this. Who is where is the eternal kingdom and when is it going to come? And so there is this idea of, sort of survival. But at the same time, there is this idea, this acknowledgement that everything, right, not only humans, but human institutions have this cyclicality, have this birth, growth, and decay. And I think part of that is just, as I think I've already sort of said, right, just bring it on this macro cosmic scale, right? It's not just the individual, and Lucretius is pretty specific, talking about how individuals die and then how the earth dies as well in terms of, just growing old. So I think, that's one key thing behind it is just sort of this driving this point home about mortality. At the same time, as I said, right, many thinkers, also said, right, the world itself will persist, or the universe will persist. Our sort of individual achievements are limited, but, there is sort of this persistence of nature itself or the cosmos itself. So I think there is sort of this idea of, thinking in terms of teleology of ourselves and our world, but also this idea that, things do persist outside it. So I think part of it is, to gain sort of the view from above or a cosmic perspective, right? To understand, much like environmental, ism today, right? To understand sort of the bigger picture and to understand our place in the nature of the universe as individuals, as being very finite, but as seeing our place in a bigger picture in terms of the history of the universe and geological history as well.
So to kind of continue on that idea about being able to see the bigger picture, do you think the ancients sort of would have thrown around the term apocalyptic a little bit more casually than we might today, because it would be kind of restrained by their knowledge of what was happening outside of their region, for instance?
Yeah, that's interesting. So apocalyptic, right, is an interesting word. And how it's one word. Actually, I'm sort of working on a study with a colleague about how it's a word that gets thrown around a lot today, or apocalyptic, and maybe in the earlier 20th century, it wasn't so much. When you used it, you were sort of specifically referring to the Book of Revelation. So I mean, it's interesting. It seems that in a sense, the word apocalypse specifically, and where we have apocalyptic, is specific to sort of the Christian context, right? John says this is an apocalypse, right, of Jesus Christ. And that specifically means, right, a revelation, that, the secret knowledge is being revealed. And the Greeks and Romans at least wouldn't use that word, right? Even though it is a Greek word and it becomes a Latin word, and then sort of into the modern languages, they didn't have that term, right? They had other words that we would use. Obviously, catastrophe certainly is one, right? This sudden change. Cataclysm is another word, right? That Plato will use a lot, which basically means like a big flood, literally. So they had their own words, as I said, sort of ekpyrosis as well for the Stoics, right? The burning up of fire, or dissipation, the scattering of atoms. So to come back to my point, they wouldn't necessarily use the word. They would use some words we're familiar with. They wouldn't definitely use the word apocalypse or apocalyptic, but certainly catastrophic, cataclysmic, ekpyrosis, as I said, or the idea of fire, right? So they would definitely, and a lot of times the word you use would also sort of determine sort of your philosophical allegiance, right? So if you use the word, if you talked about the future and the coming ekpyrosis, you'd sort of, would signal yourself as a Stoic. If you talked about dissipation of atoms, right, you'd signal yourself as an Epicurean. If you talked about periodic catastrophes or cataclysms, you were sort of more in the Platonic tradition. So they had their own words in some ways, in some ways based on, Greek words, just like apocalypse, but they would, the words that they were throwing around were in some ways similar, but also very different than the words we would use today.
That's like their ancient virtue signaling, this is
Right.
this is my tribe.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's on some ways it's philosophical, right? It's not this divine revelation that, you can predict. And, Cicero even says there are people predicting, when the next flood's going to come or when the next fire is going to come, not through, divination or divine revelation, but by actual studying, the heavens, studying the stars, studying the universe, right? So there is, sort of this idea of, for lack of a better phrase, sort of rational study, right? Studying nature. And even Xenophanes, who's a pre-Socratic philosopher in the 6th century, has sort of proof. He says, well, of course there were floods. Look, we're finding seashells and mountains, and we're finding fossils of fish in caves and things like that. So, they're going around and looking for, signs, much the way we would think of, a geologist or something, as opposed to, necessarily saying we have to wait for God to reveal what the future holds.
It's so fascinating when it gets into what are the causes of these disasters and end of days. And, you have, of course, as you say, like the supernatural, you've got the gods, you've got just the natural, like trying to understand the planet, you've got the kind of the universal, the cyclical. And I guess it's interesting, the sort of anthropogenic concerns of how it comes in, that maybe historically it had to do with morality more, we've kind of continued that to this day, though, because we do still attach a lot of morality to what we now worry about for the end of days.
The idea of anthropogenic, to come back to this idea of morality, a lot of it has to do, I think, with this idea of, as I've said, keeping humans within limits. This idea that humans can go too far, and there is this idea too in modern philosophy or modern thought about this great filter. That some philosophers who think sort of this long-termism, if there's life on, if there was life on Mars or something like that, is there proof that life happens and then stops, right, throughout the universe? And comes into the Fermi paradox, right? Why are there no why hasn't an advanced society found us, right? If the universe is so varied, where are the aliens? And one answer to that is, well, the universe only lets societies develop so far. They never get the technology to live in Star Wars, where they can sort of travel back and forth and colonize the galaxy. So that's one theory, and I think the ancients sort of have sort of anticipate that in some sense, that the universe, again, they're only talking about sort of our planet, but that the universe sort of puts this hard stop on our development of technology and our development as a civilization.
I think that might be a strong point for the whole AI conversation.
Yes, yeah, I think so. I mean, I think some of the argument about AI is that you see this in the ancient thought as well, is that technology is great, but you've got to really understand it before you put it to work, right? That Seneca talks about the first sailor goes off and it's great. He's built this boat. He's got this technological development, but they don't know the winds, they don't know the stars, they just sort of go off, but they don't understand sort of the bigger system of the technology and the knowledge you need to sail, right? They just sort of jump into it feet first, and that leads to its problems. Yeah, so the ancients were sort of very aware of the double-edged nature of technology, that yes, there are a lot of positives to it, but there's also a lot of negatives and things we've got to be wary of. And even today, right? The invention of the computer came the invention of the computer crash, right? That you've got once you invent something, you usually have sort of this negative that you have to sort of also figure out how to deal with. And I think that's some of the arguments against, right, about being cautious about AI is we don't really know how it works, and we've got to be careful. And you see that already in Seneca, talking about sailing, for example, that humans got this technology, but they didn't understand the bigger picture, and that sort of got them into trouble.
Well, yeah, I think that there's quite a few people now advocating that we should take a 6-month pause on the development of AI, so to contemplate some of the ethical and maybe unforeseen black swan consequences, which I personally think, yeah, when you have these huge jumps in developments, as exciting as they may be, there are unintended consequences that sort of naturally happens. And I know for some people, the thought of thinking of the end of days is sort of a morbid, depressive subject. But why should we do it then?
I think you're absolutely right. That's an interesting question. On the one hand, we can't deny the fascination, and I think fascination is sort of the right word. Sort of fear, but also unable to look away, right? Unable to think about what the end of the world might look like. And that, as we said at the beginning, seems to be something very human, or at least sort of part of Greek and Roman and Jewish and Christian thought, that there's something already there that we have, that we've just got it's almost sort of cognitive within us to envision, right, sort of the end. And to come back to your point earlier that I meant to bring in, this idea of population and things like that. The earliest sort of stories, right, of the flood, in Mesopotamia, the reason the flood ultimately comes is because the gods, there's just too many people. There is this problem of overpopulation already in some of the earliest stories we have about cataclysms. And again, this is a long time ago in the past, but there is sort of this idea of, right, population. The gods get angry at us. Humans are too noisy, so there's already that, sort of thinking about, can we be too successful? And what are the consequences of there just being too many people in the world? So there's that. I don't think it's morbid in the sense that I think that, as I said, I do think that the ancients we're onto something in thinking about these different scenarios, about different ways the future, what the future could hold, and I think in some ways that's good, right, to think about the potential catastrophes that lie ahead. And that's something that humans, especially since 1945, with the development of atomic war and energy, that this idea of we've got to really think about scenarios, because we can't, this is something that we can't do empirically. We can't test environmental catastrophe and see what happens. We can't test nuclear catastrophe, right, and see what happens. Once it happens, and we're living in this world. So I think it is sort of really important to think about different potential ideas, and that's something that the ancients did, and they debated it back and forth. Is it atoms? Is it an ekpyrosis? Is it that? They didn't try to prevent it, right? I think that's one thing that we can build upon, sort of the ancient ideas that, they did see it as hardwired in the universe. So I think that that's one thing, in some ways, sort of a cognitive leap that we do have, this idea that hopefully, right, we can well, here's sort of the paradox. We can develop technology, perhaps, to prevent it, or we can live in a different way. And I think that, ties into both ancient thought, both religious, Jewish and Christian, and Stoics and Epicureans, especially this idea of, living within your means, understanding nature, sort of change your life. Perhaps that can, they didn't necessarily think that would prevent an apocalypse, but I think, that's sort of the rhetoric of today, how we have to think about living in a different way, with this threat of catastrophe over us. I think that's, something that the ancients in many different modes of thought have, this idea that the apocalypse or the threat of the apocalypse is a call to live differently, because, right, we're on this trajectory. And so there is perhaps potential to change and prevent. And at the same time, too, there's modern psychological studies. There's studies, right? This idea, as we talked about, sort of this idea of morbid fascination, that some people are arguing that, right, imagining your end or imagining the end of the world, or, can help you cope in some ways, right? I think there was a study that, people who watched apocalyptic movies coped with COVID better, right? This idea that, perhaps it sort of triggers something in your brain, or this idea that, imagining the worst possible case can prepare you for the worst possible case, or at least, something unimaginable, or, this radical change, to your life and to the world. And that's sort of, I think, the knowledge that, especially the Greeks and the Romans, from the philosophical idea, was that, like the Stoics, right? You should be able to go out and meet every obstacle, with resilience. And they also included, right, the end of the world, right? You should be able to meet that and not be afraid.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to think the Stoics you'd have the concept of something being outside of your control, like the end of the world is, if you think an asteroid's going to plummet into you, you certainly don't have control over that. But that once you know it's out of your control, then you can kind of relax a little bit. Exactly. But at the same time, for the catastrophic things, the things that don't completely wipe out the world, the idea of becoming a bit anti-fragile, learning to live with less, knowing that you say, like, if you can be fine sleeping on a floor and eating lentils, you're going to have a much easier time if things ever get difficult, even if they're not that complete end of the world. It definitely can make you more capable. And I must say, I'm very fortunate that I've spent a lot of time, even in my childhood, in, very developing countries where you have long periods without electricity, or you have no running water, or water that, like, you could not drink at all. Like, and it's kind of, so then when you're older and you kind of deal with these inconveniences, or electricity going out because of a storm, you know how to handle it. It's much easier, and getting those experiences when you're younger kind of fortifies you when you're older, personally. So I like to take your kids camping, people.
Yeah. I mean, as I said, I think you're right. Part of it is, and I think especially the Epicureans, understanding that you have to live within limits, and that you don't need all of these comforts in your life, and perhaps exactly they could be taken away from you. And I think that's sort of the, at least especially in the West, or developing countries, the fascination with these post-apocalyptic stories, right? It's like, okay, well, what would I need? Do I have the skills to survive? What is necessary? What is not necessary? I think that's also sort of part of this questioning, as well, about our development and our society. And the reality is, as you say, as I said, much of apocalyptic thought, especially today, and especially for the Greeks and the Romans, and that's the interesting contrast, right? So we think of Jewish and Christian apocalyptic thought, sort of outsiders, people, against empire, people trying to find a voice. But the Greeks and the Romans, certainly Plato, Seneca, especially, living at the center of power, right? Living in the lap of luxury. Seneca was probably the wealthiest man, in Rome, next to the emperor. And, he's sort of, I think, too, sort of thinking about those sort of ideas. So it's interesting to see that, much like today, people living in advanced society and living in, with wealth and privilege. I think that the Seneca sort of also sort of and the Romans especially sort of speak to sort of our more sort of modern, at least Western, sort of looking at sort of this stripping away of society and this ending of our world. And part of it, I think, is sort of critiquing luxury, as Seneca comes out and says. And I think the reality too that we have to remember is a lot of especially contemporary thought, much like the Greeks and Romans, is, as I said, fear of losing what we have, the comforts, the development, the technology. And the reality is, right, as you alluded to, many people, or perhaps a large majority of the world today, is living in what I would at least consider post-apocalyptic conditions, right? So we have that there is this divide that we have to think about today, that, and the apocalypse, and the idea too that the apocalypse has happened, or, catastrophes have happened, society-ending catastrophes have happened to peoples throughout history, right, as well, that there have been, think about the discovery of the New World, right? For example, right? Genocide, and that sort of idea that there have been sort of these existential crises that have happened to peoples throughout the world. And Columbus is an interesting figure because, right, he saw himself. He published this book of prophecies where he brings in Seneca and he brings in biblical text as well, where he sort of saw himself as, right, sort of this apocalyptic figure in, for him, in the good sense, sort of fulfilling these prophecies that there is lands out there to the west. There are new worlds, quite literally, sort of this biblical idea. And, as I said, sort of the paradox of that is right, sort of the apocalypses that happened to native cultures, right, throughout the Western Hemisphere. So there is this, this idea we have to remember, I think, too, that in some ways apocalypses have happened. And, when we think about sort of the massive one, wiping everything out, I think a lot of it has to do with the end of sort of the comforts of, Western civilization has given us.
One man's prophecy is another man's apocalypse.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. Well, it's good things to keep in mind. I'll sleep well tonight.
Yeah, right. I hope so.
Well, thank you so much, Christopher. It's really fascinating as always. And I'll link to your book below so that everyone can read for themselves and learn a bit more about, the end of days and philosophically how to approach them. I think it's a really interesting topic. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to Classical Wisdom Speaks, a podcast dedicated to bringing ancient wisdom to modern minds.